So now that we've taken the time to learn about each one of the lights individually and some of their settings, let's go ahead and start adding light here into our scene. Now before you add light into your scene, you really want to take a moment to ask yourself, what is the mood that you're trying to create? What's the time of day? What part of the world is your universe in? So, or I should say, what part of the universe is your world in? Thinking about these things and thinking about light as if it's a character inside the game is just as important as putting attention into your actual characters. Whether you're thinking about texturing, lighting, sound, all these different elements in video games are just as important as the characters you work with, because the environment is a character, and you really want to put a lot of energy and intention. Don't just start throwing lights into your scene trying to get it illuminated. Take a moment to ask yourself these questions, and you'll always create much better lighting inside of your scene. And it's always very obvious to see a video game where energy and attention was put into one area, like maybe character development, but then kind of wasn't really thought about so much in another area, like maybe the sound is terrible, or the texturings is terrible, or maybe the lighting is off. And even if you're not a great artist, everyone's always capable of seeing that and kind of feeling like there's something wrong. So for my world, I'm going to think about this being a little bit later in the day. Obviously, we're outside, so I want to use an infinite light source. So we're going to go up to our game objects, and I'm going to be using the directional light. As I described in an earlier video, this directional light acts like a huge light source, like the sun. And we don't need to worry about where we actually move this light source. I'm just kind of moving it into view here, because where we move it doesn't have any effect on how the light casts inside our scene. So moving and scaling a directional light will have no impact on the lighting, but rotating it will have all the impact. So if I were to rotate it to something like this would be our sun directly on the horizon at sunset. And if I were to rotate it straight down, this would be our sun at 12 o'clock. So again, we're thinking about this like we would in the real world. Where is our sun and what time of day it is? So for me, I'd like it to be a little bit later in the day. So I'm going to choose an angle, an extreme angle like that. So I'm going to call that around 6 o'clock, 5 or 6 o'clock in the afternoon as the sun is coming down. And because our sun is setting, think about what the sun looks like in the middle of the day at 12 o'clock. Well, it's very, very yellow, and it's very, very bright. In fact, if you just look at it, you're going to burn your eyes and just see a white glow in the sky. So if our sun were pointing straight down, then we might kind of keep it in this white region. But remember, as I said earlier, there's no such thing as pure white light, so you always want to give it a little bit of warmth. But as the sun starts to set in the day, what are the colors that you see in the sky? Obviously, you start to see warmer colors. So again, all of this might be really obvious to you. In fact, I'm sure it is. You've been, watching the sun your entire life, but it isn't always exactly obvious when you're building 3D worlds or games. It's so important to just take a moment and think about things and ask yourself those questions. We get so excited about creating other elements that we forget some of the most important elements, like lighting, which is why I'm taking so much time to talk about it. So because my sun is starting to set in the day, I'm of course going to take the color and I'm going to warm this up a little bit. So I'll just click on the color box here, and in my color picker just find a bit of a warmer hue. So you can see very quickly as I adjust this, it completely changes the feel of the scene. Once we get into these kind of warm oranges and yellows, we kind of feel like we're a little bit later in the day. Now, I'm not a really big fan as to how directional lights actually light the scene. It's very harsh, very, very strong lights and shadows. And we could take the time to add in a lot of different directional lights to get kind of fill and bounce, but we're just going to worry about one directional light to give that feeling of a major light source coming from one direction. But because I'm not a big fan of it, I'm actually going to turn the intensity down quite a bit. So instead of 0.5, we're going to do something like 0.23. So this is a little bit too dark for our scene, but it definitely casts that major light source, and it also adds a little bit of color. We're kind of painting our entire scene with a little bit of an orange hue. And that's because we are free to do whatever we want in this universe, and the next set of lights that I'm going to use are a little bit more special effect-like. Obviously this isn't a real world. We have floating islands here in the middle of an ocean, so we can, of course, be artistic and fun with it. So now that we've set up that first major light source, I'm going to create a spotlight and focus in on this area here. We're going to do some fun particles here in a little bit, so we want to kind of highlight this area. So if you have a game where maybe your character has to get to a certain location, we obviously want to highlight that location with lighting. Again, we're thinking about lighting as an important character in this play that we're creating. So we'll go up to Game Objects, we'll go down to Other, and then of course over to Spotlight. And then how we position the spotlight obviously affects the light source, because the spotlight works just like a flashlight. So we'll get this right on top of this box here. And once we have that centered, we can start adjusting some of these attributes that we talked about earlier. Like spot angle, we'll go ahead and open that light up quite a bit. So we can do something like that. Intensity will increase the brightness. So if we really want to draw attention to this location, we're going to make it very, very bright. But we won't make it too bright. And then of course, because we've already loaded them in a previous video, if we wanted to add in a cookie and just make it a little bit more interesting, we definitely could. But I think the only one that I'm going to worry about right now is maybe the soft or the grid to kind of make that area a little bit interesting. But it wouldn't make sense to have the grid because we are outside and there's nothing up here that would cast that shadow. So I'm just going to use the soft, and because I'm using the soft, I'm going to have to turn the intensity up quite a bit. And then I'll turn the range up a little bit as well, because each one of those cookies is going to kind of block some of the light. So you can see now, because I'm using that cookie, we get a nice soft fall off here on the edge. If I weren't using that cookie, we'd have this hard rim here, and that wouldn't look quite as realistic and nice inside our scene. So that's pretty much the only spotlight that I'm going to be using. The rest of the lights that I'm going to be using are actually point lights, because as we learned in an earlier video, they cast a really nice soft light in all directions. So you can light it pretty much any way that you want now. If you want to put a lot of focus on the ground, you can. If you want to put a lot of focus on the trees, you can. If later you model in some lights like street lamps, maybe you want to use these point lights. So I'm going to go back up to Game Object, Create Other, and then down to Point Light. And then we can position these point lights in space. And we can start illuminating our environment here. So that's quite intense. So there's a few things that we can adjust here. One, you can see that our light's region expands quite a bit. And also the light intensity, as I mentioned earlier, is very, very, very sensitive. So maybe you want things to be kind of this bright here inside your scene. But I think I want to calm this down just a little bit. We don't need things illuminated that much. So we can take the range down a little bit. So I'll take that down to something like 5. And you can see right away between the range or the intensity, we dramatically change the intensity of that light. So you can do it either way. And of course, we are going to kind of change the color of the light a little bit. And if you add any color to the light, you're actually taking away a little bit of the light strength. So if I made a light completely black, there's no such thing as black light, unless you're into neon colors, but you know what I mean. There's no such thing as light that actually illuminates black. So the darker you make this color, the more you're going to have to push up the intensity. So for instance, if I were to make this light very, very dark, I'd have to take the intensity value up quite a bit to get any sort of illumination off of that. And if we bring this back to a lighter color, you can see the intensity picks back up. So it's kind of a play between the intensity and the color. And I think it's kind of fun that we have these kind of blue lights here in our scene contrasting with the overall orange light. So you can keep creating lights, but if you've created one light that you kind of like its settings, of course we can duplicate this light. And when you do, you can see that right away it gets bright. We didn't actually make one light brighter, we just have two lights on top of each other, so of course they're going to add more light to the scene. And just like our trees, we want to take a moment to kind of adjust these and make them a little uneven. So maybe one's closer to the ground, maybe one's higher up. And also pay attention to where your character is going to be sitting. Our character is actually going to be sitting inside here, looking up at these trees. So this is a lot of light, and we don't actually have any real light sources in our scene, but I think this looks pretty fun to kind of have all these bright lights illuminating these interesting trees. And it's also nice to have lighting that kind of doesn't just fill everything. I think most video games tend to be very dark in the first place, but it's nice to have kind of spots in certain areas because it just takes something that was a very basic texture like this metal, and now all of a sudden we have a very interesting pattern on this surface. If we look at this, now we have this nice fall off on this metal ramp here. And then we'll just duplicate this a few more times. And when you work on creating your own levels or creating your own 3D geometry to bring into your levels, of course you can think about all the different lamps and light sources that you'll create. But we're working in a fantasy environment here and just getting to know Unity, so we're not going to worry about where this light is actually coming from. I know we're breaking some rules of reality, but then again, we are working in a video game, so we can break any rules that we want. So just a few more lights to finish everything up. And it's amazing with how just a few lights in our scene we can really bring a lot of feeling and atmosphere. So again, I'm just not putting the lights in the exact same place every single time. I'm just kind of scattering them around. Some of my trees are dark, some of my trees are bright. If we jump in here and we look around, we can see some are illuminated, some aren't. And then let's just take one quick look down in here, see how the lights are looking. And I think that's looking pretty good. It looks like all the light source is kind of coming in from these areas of attention, which is kind of where our game is going to start in this area. And everything is well lit, but it kind of gives this dark, mysterious atmosphere. And that's looking good for our game so far. So take a moment to play around with different lighting schemes in your game, change the intensities of the lights. Try to use as few lights as possible. A really good rule of thumb when you're working in the industry, either computer animation, film, or game design, is the term "it's very expensive" often comes into play. And what do I mean by that? Each one of these lights might be very expensive. Well, they didn't actually cost you anything, so why do they use that terminology? And the reason is because in the real world, actually, the amount of time it takes to render something actually does cost money. So that's why that they say certain assets and certain lights can be very expensive, because if it's taking up time on a machine to render, then it's actually costing the studio a lot of money. So lights can often slow performance down. In this case, the way the Unity engine works, you don't really have to worry about that, especially for such a simple scene. But when working in other computer animated softwares, anytime you add in a light, it's greatly going to slow down the render time, and it's going to make the production even more expensive. And time is money. So when you're creating these scenes, try to use as few lights as possible. And that doesn't mean that you're not going to use a lot of lights. I just always want you to be very careful about your placement of every single light. Think about what the atmosphere is like. Take the time to place them and make your scene beautiful. Don't just throw in a bunch of lights like most beginners have a habit of doing. So now that we've pretty much dressed up our scene with geometry, textures, and lights, let's make things even more interesting by adding in some particle systems. So that's actually going to be the next package that we load here inside Unity. Again, as you remember, we avoided loading in all the packages in the beginning when we created the project so that we could load them as we go along and learn about them. So again, down here in our asset list, we're just going to right-click and then we're going to import a new package. And then this one is going to be the particles package. So go ahead and locate that here in your list. At this point, you can go ahead and click Import. And now that that's imported, if you double click on your standard assets folder down here, you're going to see that you have a folder called Particles. So we can double click on that Particles folder, and you can see you have a lot of different things in here: dust, fire, legacy, miscellaneous, smoke, sources, sparkles, and water. So what we're going to do is actually set up our first set of particles over here on this box that I said we were going to pay a lot of attention to. This would kind of maybe be an important location for our character to get to. So let's just double click on these sparkles. And just like many other things here inside Unity, it's as easy as drag and drop. So if I take this particle cube right here and just drag this into my scene on top of this cube here, you can see now we have some beautiful sparkles coming out of this cube. And just like all of the other assets that we've been working with, we can kind of use these manipulators to drag them over. So we can position this pretty much anywhere we want. So when you have the particle game object selected, you're actually going to see it doing this kind of real-time preview here inside Unity. But when it's not selected, like if I click on another object, you can see it freezes. So it's a great way to kind of see exactly what's going on with each particle system without having to run the game. Now, one thing is you might not notice a particle node. I mean, you can always kind of just click in this area right here and it'll select it. But if the particles haven't started emitting yet from this particle emitter, then don't forget that here in your hierarchy, you're going to be able to find it. So you can see that we have this sparkles rising particle system right here. So the next particle system that we're actually going to add into our scene is fire. Now you can add this pretty much anywhere you want. As I mentioned, we're just creating kind of this fantasy world. So on this nice metal area here, I think is where I'm going to add mine. So we'll go back to our particles folder, and then you notice that you have a fire folder that we can double click on. And there's Fire 1 and Flames. So let's go ahead and take Fire 1 and just drag it on top of this platform. And you can see Fire 1 kind of gives us this effect of maybe a spill. So for instance, if something spilled on the ground, we have this fire which is very, very low to the ground, and it's kind of hugging the platform. And that may be what we want, maybe it's not what we want. But it does look like as if we spilled some gasoline on the floor, and there's lots and lots of smoke coming off of this fire. And that's exactly what Fire 1 will do. So if I take a moment to delete this and just drag in Flames, then you can see we almost kind of get this taller region of fire, which is what I'm going to stick with for right now. So we'll stick with that. And if we needed to duplicate this like any of our objects, of course we could. So we can just drag that over. And again, notice how when I deselected one particle system, it stopped moving, and the one that I have selected started moving. So that's because we can just kind of look at our different particle systems as we click on them and experiment with changing them as we go along. So the final particle system that we'll be adding in here is with water. So we'll go again back to our particle folder, and I'm going to double click on water. And you can see we have a few interesting ones here. We don't have a fountain in our scene, but I'll just show you that one real quick. I'll drag fountain into our scene, and you can see we get a great particle fountain spewing out of the water, or out of the ground, I should say. So we'll just go ahead and delete that. And of course we have waterfall, so we can put this anywhere that we want. So if we wanted a waterfall kind of coming off of our surface here, we could. And if we needed to rotate its direction, we could do that as well. So if we took the time to model in another package a nice waterfall, we could of course get that running inside our scene. But the water that we're actually going to use is this water surface, which is really cool. It kind of just brings a little bit of energy to these surfaces down here. So I dragged it onto this surface, but you notice that it kind of ended up a little bit below, so we couldn't see it. So you just want to drag these up a tiny bit. And we can duplicate this and kind of just move this around. And duplicate it a few times. And it kind of just makes things interesting out here in space. Again, if you have trouble selecting a particle system, don't forget that you can come back into your hierarchy here and select it. Because I kind of lost the ability to select that one. And then we'll just put a few of these random particle sets around our level. That way when we look down into this kind of watery area, things look a little bit more interesting. Now you'll notice when you actually have some of these particle sets selected here in the inspector, you have quite a bit of attributes that you can work with. Now I'm not going to go through all of these. I think I could take up an entire series talking about particle manipulation and going over each one of their settings. But don't hesitate to do the same thing I did with the lights, which is to create a new empty scene and then just add one particle emitter to that scene and then kind of go through each one of these attributes. The people over at Unity really have done an amazing job at making everything pretty easy to understand and pretty easy to experiment with. You want to make sure that you're not experimenting in a large scene like this that you've taken the time to set up, but in a blank document or a blank scene. But go through each one of these attributes and just start kind of clicking and changing each one. You'll be amazed how quickly you learn and understand exactly what each one of these things are doing. So that's all that we're going to be doing as far as setting up for our particles. You can put as many as you want here into your scene. Again, don't forget that particles can be a bit expensive on render time, but we're just working with Unity, so at this point, go crazy and add in as many particles as you want. I'm sure, like me, the first time you work with particles, you're just going to populate your entire world with particle effects that look pretty amazing. And of course, take a moment to go through your particle library here and realize that there's actually a lot of different particles that you can work with, smoke and different interesting particle systems. Soap bubbles, fireworks. It's another kind of interesting one, is this firework particle system. All of these things can of course have triggers and be animated, so they're not just kind of looping like this. They can be set up to actually show up when a certain thing happens. We won't get into triggers or animation in this series. That's kind of a bit more advanced, but just wanted you to be aware that that's what's waiting for you as you continue learning Unity, is that all of these things can kind of explode or start up on command. So if your character were to blow up a barrel, then you'd want this particle system to come into place. So take a moment to experiment with the particles in an empty scene. Take a moment to adjust some of these attributes. You'll be surprised how easy it is to create some very interesting looks. So that's pretty much it as far as designing our level. And you can see that it didn't take a lot of time at all to actually create this entire universe with lights, textures, geometry, particle effects, and it actually took longer than it would need because I'm sitting here explaining every little detail to you. But you can imagine as you go through this process and create individual worlds, it's just amazing how quickly you can start creating some interesting gameplay environments. And even though Unity isn't really meant to be the type of engine where you create everything inside Unity, you really want to work with other 3D packages when you're modeling things for Unity. It's amazing that you can actually rapid prototype these worlds and come up with some really fun game ideas. Really, it's just about collecting some great textures from the internet so that your world doesn't look boring and gray. So now that we're done building all of this, we've been exploring this kind of here inside the scene view. But if we were to hit play and run our game, so we'll take a moment to do that, we get this. And that is not what we want at all. This is, nothing happens, and we're just kind of looking at this empty environment here. That's because our main camera, if I can locate it, let's see, where is our main camera setting? It's somewhere, it's this little tiny icon off in space, and it may be difficult to locate, but we actually don't need to locate it because it's not important to us right now. What we're actually going to be doing in this video is adding in some character controllers, and that is really where we can start playing our game. So this is another package that we're going to be loading in. So we'll just go back to the top of our folder list here in our asset library, and I'm going to right click again, and we're going to import another package. And you're going to notice that the very first package here is character controller. So go ahead and take a moment to import that. We'll import everything as always. Give that a moment to import all the different files associated with the character controller. And once that's done importing, again, if you double click on your standard assets folder, you're going to see that you now have a character controller folder. So we'll double click on that to open that up. And you have two different types of character controllers in Unity by default, and these both are really, really useful. The one that we're going to be using for our level is the first-person character controller, but we also have a third-person character controller. Now, I'm sure most of you watching these videos have played these different types of video games before. Now, obviously, first-person is kind of where you're like living in the body of the character you're playing. You don't necessarily see yourself unless you look in a mirror, or you can kind of see your hands or the gun that you're holding. Third person is actually where you see the character running around. And just like many of the other attributes here inside Unity, this is all pretty simple and drag and drop. So we're not going to use third person, but let's take a moment to kind of just explore third person because maybe that's the type of character controller you want to use for your game. So we'll just click and drag third person into our game. And we have this guy sitting kind of halfway into the ground. I'm going to press the F key to zoom in on him here. And we'll just use our move tool to kind of just move him up so that he looks like he's sitting or standing right on top of our ground there. He's this weird kind of mechanic-y looking guy, and this is just the default Unity third-person character controller. So what happens now? Now that we've added this character controller into our game, we actually have a fully functional game, and that's what's so exciting. We created our quick level, we dropped a character controller in, and now watch what happens when I press play. Instead of just ending up in outer space somewhere over here, we actually end up with our weird mechanic guy running. Now, as I mentioned, we're not going to get into animation in this video series. That's for a more advanced video series down the road. But you can actually get your characters to animate any kind of way that you want. But if we just use our arrow keys at the moment, you can either use your WSAD combination, or you can actually use your left arrow button, forward, back, right. So I'm just using my arrow keys to control this guy right now. I can actually start exploring my entire level using this guy. And now you can see the fruits of your labor here as we kind of run around and explore what we've created. Now, because the third-person character controller has some unique scripting in it, you can see as we move our character around, the camera is adjusting. So if I push my character to the left, the camera is always essentially facing his back. That's the way that this character controller is working. We can press the space bar to jump. And now that we've ended up down in here, we're kind of stuck, and this is kind of the end of our level anyways. So that is the third-person character controller. We're not really going to get into any of its attributes, but of course, once you've created this character, you'll notice that you have all these different attributes that you can adjust. I do suggest that you pause the game before adjusting all of these things, because right now the game system is taking up a lot on your processor. So we're going to pause this. And if we wanted to adjust any of these values, we can do now and then retest our character. So I don't want to use this guy. We want to go ahead and use the first person. So we're going to select this and then delete that character controller. And the character controller that I want to use is actually the first person character controller. So we see that our first person character controller looks like a big blue pill with a camera embedded in it. And that's because there's no geometry associated with our first person character controller, because if we hit this play button right now, you can see that instead of looking at our character, now we've actually ended up inside our character itself. And now we've kind of just fallen through the floor and we're looking at this environment. If I use my mouse, I can kind of scroll around this environment. But because, let me pause this real quick, but because we don't need to actually see this character, and we're actually living in the body of the character. That's why there's no geometry. Now, if you were creating a game that was maybe like an online game where other people might see you, well, you don't want them to see this kind of blue pill. You want them to actually see a character. And you can, of course, swap out this geometry with any sort of models that you create. So let's adjust things a little bit more. So I'm going to position my character where I want him to start off. So I'm going to put him kind of in the center of this environment. And I'll just scale him down a little bit. Not that that makes a difference, but it just helps me kind of see the scale in this environment a little bit. Let's play this real quick. And you can see now we're actually sitting on the grass. So why did we fall through? Well, if you noticed when I first placed this guy before, I kind of placed him down here intersecting the ground, and that made him fall through the universe and kind of end up on our other ground surface, which is this water. So if we wanted to avoid that, we're just going to make sure that he's just kind of floating right above this ground surface here. So again, we can use the mouse to kind of look around the environment in this first person character controller, and we can use the W key to move forward, the A key to move sideways, the D key to move sideways in the other direction, and then the S key to move back. Or if you're right-handed, of course, you can use your mouse or your arrow keys forward, back, left, and right, while you're also using your mouse to kind of look at 3D space. So now let's navigate around with this character controller, which I think is a lot easier to navigate this environment using this character controller. I'll just kind of stand at the edge of this platform here and look down. And then of course we can jump off here as well. So again, with this character controller, the space bar is going to equal jump. And you notice that you can actually push forward and jump at the same time. So if you needed to jump on a box like this, we could. Might take a little bit of getting used to. But you can see now we're actually sitting on top of this box. So again, we'll pause this. And that'll bring us back to our starting position where we left off and where we created our character controller. And what we want to do is actually look at a few different attributes associated with the character controller. So if you look over here in your inspector, you're going to see a lot of different attributes, and we're not going to change all of these. And some of them are just the basic position, scale, and rotation. But there are a few of these that you may want to adjust. If we open up the movement tab, the max forward speed, max sideways speed, and max backward speed, all of these values are going to kind of affect how fast our character is moving. So again, just like I said with the lighting earlier, you want to ask yourself in this case, well, who is our character? Is our character a man? Is our character a horse? Is our character a car? Is it a robot? Is it a turtle? So all of these values can affect the feeling of your character. So the max forward speed is currently set to 6. If I set this something like 2, in fact, I'll just set all of these to 2. And then we play our character. You notice that I can look around as fast as I did before, but my movement forward is much slower. So it almost feels like I'm a rolling robot or something like that at this point. I can barely move at a running speed. Everything feels kind of like a walk. And the interesting thing about this is you can adjust these later on, again with more scripting and programming in more advanced series, to be mapped to different keyboard buttons. So for instance, or different keyboard keys. So you might have a key for running, and then you might actually have a key for walking. So what I'm going to do right now is pause that. And of course, we can take our forward speed, and if you're in a wide open environment, you're working with a car as your first-person character controller, then maybe instead of 6, you want this to be set something like 12. So that's our forward speed. So let's go ahead and preview that and see how that affects our game. So now if I push this button, you can see it's super fast. In fact, it's almost a little too fast for me to even control this character. So we can just fly around in 3D space here. And it feels like we're working with a vehicle more than we're actually working with a person at this speed. Okay, so we'll pause that again. And we'll just set that back. I think even the default value of 6 is a little bit high for our tiny little level. So we'll just set all these values down to something like 5. Gravity is obviously going to affect how fast you fall and how high you can jump, but we're not going to worry about changing any of those values right now. We'll just go ahead and close down movement. And let's switch over to jumping. So as you notice, when we press the space bar, we had the ability to jump. So if we actually turn this off, then we won't have that ability to jump anymore. Our base height, let's go ahead and take that from 1, and we'll just turn that into 8, and then preview that. And then take a look at this tree, and then hit the space bar. And you can see now we're jumping like a moon man. Super high. So you may have a game where this is how you want things set up. And literally you can just jump as far as you want in outer space. So maybe you get the ability to grab a jetpack at some point, and that's why you would want to map this attribute to a specific key. You might have a jump that's just a regular jump, and then you might have a jump that's a super jump. So again, as you experiment with all these things, it's really going to give you some great ideas for games and how you want your characters to interact. So let's just go ahead and turn that back to, give it a little extra jump. So I'll do a 1.5. So things like sliding will affect on how far your character will actually slide once you stop moving them forward. If there's a little bit of extra momentum, we're not going to adjust that right now. The only other thing that we're going to take a look at with our character controller is if we jump into our main camera here. So I went into the hierarchy view, and then I clicked this down arrow to open this up. We can go ahead and click the main camera. So you can see over here, once we do that, we get this preview, which is going to show us exactly what our character is looking at and what our character is seeing. That way, when we actually adjust our character here, or adjust that main camera, we can kind of see what's going on. And in this main camera value, we can also adjust a few things like the background. So right now our background is a dark blue. If we want, we can set this to black. We can set the sky to kind of a little bit more of a sunset color. And then if we take a moment to preview this, we can actually see the new background in play. See, so now we have a nice red sky, which, just like our lighting earlier, it has a huge impact on the atmosphere and the feeling of the game. So take a moment to experiment with that as well. And finally, as far as the main camera is concerned, the other last option that I want you to look at is this field of view. I know that this window might be a little bit small for you to see, but when you experiment with this on your own, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. If we adjust the field of view, you can see that you can get this very weird wide perspective. So I'll just preview that so you can see what I'm talking about. So you can see we now have this world where we almost look like we're looking through kind of a fisheye lens of some kind. It's just very strange. We can see a lot of our world here. So there, again, might be an extreme circumstance where you want to push things to this level. Personally, I think you'll get sick if you play the game this way. But it's a very interesting attribute to change and adjust. So let's go ahead and pause that. And let's take our field of view back down to something a little bit more reasonable. You can, of course, also flatten this out, which will really be a very narrow field of view, and you'll just be looking like you have your nose right up against everything. So let's go ahead and get this adjusted back to kind of where we had it. I believe it's about 60 for default. And I'm going to get rid of this ugly brownish orange sky and bring things back to kind of a blue color, or dark blue is nice. And there is one last thing that I forgot to review as far as the first-person controller is concerned. And that's this value called slope limit. So what exactly is slope limit? And if you're going to have any sort of slopes, like this ramp that you see here, this is an important value to pay attention to. If I were to just preview this right now and try to go up this ramp, you notice that my character has no problem going up this ramp, and no problem actually going down the ramp as well. And that's because of how my slope limit is set. So for instance, you can see there's no hesitation going up the ramp. So let's go ahead and stop this real quick, and let's take a look at our slope limit. Right now it's set to 45 by default, but if I were to turn this down to something like 5 and then run my simulation, and we try to go up this ramp, you can see we're just bumping into the ramp over and over, and it's a little too steep for us to get up. So that's where this slope limit comes into play, and is very important. Now, with this ramp, we actually want to be able to run up this ramp. But again, if you're a gamer, I'm sure you've come across video games where things work a little bit weird. There might be kind of the side of a mountain where you kind of can run up it a little too fast. And that's because they haven't taken the time to get their slope limit exactly accurate. So we want to be able to kind of run up a 45-degree slope like this. But if we had a mountain that was getting steeper and steeper and steeper as it went up, we wouldn't want to be able to kind of just run up a straight wall, or almost a straight wall. That wouldn't make sense. So that is where you are going to change that attribute so that you can enable your characters to run up something like this, no problem. But then when it came to a very, very steep mountain, they wouldn't be able to run up that, because that just wouldn't make sense at all. So take a moment to adjust both the third-person character controller and the first-person character controller. But as I mentioned, with this level, it's definitely more suited for the first-person character controller. And I think it's a lot more fun, and you'll often be using those types of character controls. And we took the time to create this very quick level here, but it's amazing how quickly you can rapid prototype other levels. So take a moment to think about it. Even step outside Unity and sketch out some ideas before you jump into Unity about the types of levels that you want to create. Don't be bogged down with the software itself before you start thinking of some levels. Sketching out ideas and coming up with level ideas in your head before you even come into Unity, and asking yourself what you want to do is going to make you a much better level designer. But now that you've built your first level, created particles, added textures, lights, and created all of this geometry that we have floating out here, I hope that you'll take the time to create even more advanced levels and explore and experiment with some of these features. The particle features, the tree builder that we touched on, adding different textures and feelings to things, and of course creating your own unique levels. So now that you've taken the time to build this game world here inside Unity, what good is it if you can't actually share it with anybody? So what we want to talk about quickly in this video is how to build and run this game and turn it into a game that you can actually share with other people. So let's go ahead and pause this simulation right now. And what we want to do is go up to File and down to Build Settings. So there's many different options, and as I said at the beginning of this series, what I love so much about Unity is that as a company they are dedicated to making sure that when you build a game inside Unity, you can actually export it to a tremendous amount of consoles and systems and devices. So as I mentioned, we can output a game for the web, we can output it for Mac, PC, or Linux. We can make it a Google Chrome game, an iOS game, so we can put it on the iPad, the iPhone, just an amazing amount from Android, Xbox, PlayStation, Wii, and even Flash Player. So, and this list keeps growing and growing. I mean, if they invent a device tomorrow, I'm pretty sure that Unity as a company will also create an output setting for that. So the quickest and easiest way to actually get your game out is by choosing the PC, Mac, and Linux standalone. Now, you do have all these other options, but I don't want you to think that you can just go ahead and click on Xbox 360 if you have one at home and start playing this game on Xbox 360. Now, don't hesitate from trying, but there are a lot of different things involved with outputting a game to iOS, Android, Xbox, PlayStation. There's things called provisioning profiles and licensing and all sorts of stuff that get in our way, and again would be dedicated to a much deeper series, more advanced pro series on Unity and actually publishing. But the amazing thing is that doesn't stop us from sharing our game with the world. We can actually publish directly to PC or Mac. So with the PC or Mac version selected, I'm of course going to select my target platform. And in this case, I'm working on a Mac, so I'm just going to keep it set to Mac OS. And then we can go ahead and click Build. Let's go ahead and name our game. So I'm going to keep my game named at First Game, and I'm just going to build that and put it on my desktop. So we'll click Save. And that's going to take a moment to build that game and take it out of Unity and actually crunch it into a playable game. Depending on how big your game is and how many assets and textures and particles and lights, it may take a while to kind of crunch and build. So now we have our first game executable here. I'm just going to double click on it. And we get a pop-up which asks me how I want to run this game. Do I want it with good graphics, beautiful, or fantastic? So I'm just going to click beautiful and the resolution, and I can start playing this game directly here on my computer. So this is a file that you can go ahead and share with your friends, and of course navigating around is exactly the way it is. I'm using my cursor, and then I'm using my keyboard buttons to go ahead and navigate, and spacebar to jump, and now I'm in a fully functional game that I can share with all of my friends. So that's really exciting. Maybe you want to email this file to your friends so that they can play your game. But another way to get your game distributed so that everybody can play it no matter where they are is by building a web version of that. So let's go ahead and take a moment to do that right now. So you can see here that we have our build settings still open. In case you forgot how I did that, I went to File and then we went to Build Settings. And this is where we choose how we want to build our game. So I'm going to click Web Player this time. Don't worry about any of these other options. With Web Player selected, we'll just click Build again. And we're going to give our game a name. So I'm just going to call this First Game, and then I'll call this Web. But you can, of course, name it whatever you want. We'll click Save. And just like before, it'll take a moment to build in all those components. Now, 99% of the time when you distribute this PC or Mac version, assuming that someone's not working on a dinosaur of an old computer, they'll be able to just simply double click on it, launch it, and start playing the game in their system. But this web version takes a little bit more work. So you can see that we have this web build here. It's actually created a folder for it, First Game Web, and inside that folder we have two files. The first file, if we take a look at these here, is an HTML file. So you might not be familiar with web development, and then the second file here is actually the Unity3D file, which is embedded into this web file here. So this HTML file is essentially like a web page, but instead of existing on the internet, it's right now sitting in this folder on your hard drive. So what good is that? Well, you could technically zip up this folder, this first game folder, and send that to your friends. And if they double click on this web file, so I'll just do that now, it's actually going to launch a web browser. And inside that web browser, you can see by default it launched Firefox on my system. We actually have the game that we can start playing. Now, it won't be that way for most of your friends because most of your friends have not downloaded or installed the Unity Web plugin. But that's really simple. When they double click on that file, it's going to bring up their web browser, but instead of seeing the game like I see right here, it's actually going to show a button saying download and install the web browser. I'm sure you've seen this happen before. Maybe you go to a website and you don't have the latest version of Flash installed, and then it asks you to go ahead and install that version of Flash. So it's pretty much the same thing. Everybody has to install the Unity web browser plugin, but once they do, they can pretty much play all of your games. Now again, why would we do this? Let me just close this window down. Why would we do this web build versus just this executable? And that's because we want people to view our game through a web browser. And we don't want to just send them a single file. But if we don't actually put this on the web, then how can we share this? So again, this whole series isn't about web development or web design, but I just wanted to take you through the steps between these two methods because you're really going to be sharing your games through either this first method or this second method. So I'm going to give you a little bit of knowledge on uploading files to the web in case you're not familiar with hosting them. The first thing you need to know is, do you have a server somewhere on the web? And if you don't have a server somewhere on the web, then the easiest thing to do is go to GoDaddy.com. And I'm not advocating one hosting server or the next. I just like GoDaddy because their customer service, if you call them 24/7, even if you're completely new to web development, they will help you. So all you need to do is go to GoDaddy or give this number a call and say, hey, I'd like a domain name and I would like a hosting account for that, and I'd like you to explain every step of the way on how to get that set up because I want to start uploading files to the web. Again, I'm not advocating GoDaddy or any other hosting services. You can choose whatever you want, and of course, if you're under the age of 18, do not buy anything without your parents' permission. I'm just simply teaching this for instructional purposes. So I already have a lot of different domains and hosting accounts, and they were often purchased through a company like GoDaddy. So let's take a look at that. Now, how do we get files up on the web? Well, I have a program called Transmit, and again, if you're using a Mac, I like Transmit, even though you can use any sort of file transfer protocol system that you like. Now, what is a file transfer protocol system, or an FTP? Well, it's essentially a software like this that you use to connect with your hosting account that you got through maybe GoDaddy. So I have a website, so I'm just going to double click on my website, and that's going to launch my website. And if we take a look inside here, we can see all the different HTML files that are involved with my website. So if I go back to this folder here where I have first game web HTML, I can drag this entire folder into my website. Now, something that's important with web addresses, if we take a look at this file right here, it says first space game space web. That was actually a bad way of naming this, because have you ever gone to a web address like www.something space something.com? No, you never put spaces between that. So when you're creating this web version, you want to make sure that you actually just make sure there are no spaces. So I'm just going to call this Unity game with no spaces .html. So I'm going to rename that. But it's probably a really good idea to name that in the beginning of this process. And same thing with this folder. I don't want any spaces between this folder. So I'm just going to go ahead and call this folder Unity. And I can take this folder and drag and drop it right now onto the web. So that's what this FTP program is. And if you're not familiar with an FTP program, File Transfer Protocol, just go ahead and Google free FTP program. You might get something like Transmit, which costs a little bit of money, which is a great application for the Mac, or you might get something called Bulletproof, which is a great application for the PC. It's really up to you. And now all I'm doing is dropping this folder here into my server. And it's going to take a moment to upload those files. And once those files are uploaded, we can go ahead and view them on the web. And now that those are finished uploading, let's just go back to a web browser. And what we need to do is just navigate to that location. So the hosting account and domain where I just uploaded all those files to was my personal website, so martinknapp.com. And then I'm going to do a slash, which essentially tells me to go into a specific folder, which if we look at where I put this, we can see that I created a folder called Unity. So we'll just type in Unity. And then we'll do another slash, which represents going into the next folder. And what we want to do is we want to take this Unity game.html and type that in here. Game.html. And if we hit return, now we're actually on the web playing this game. So you can actually send this link to all of your friends. So again, you may already know how to create websites or host websites, and if you don't, I really suggest unlearning because it's amazing to be able to create your own simple websites. But beyond that, if you just get a simple hosting account and domain, you can actually start hosting games on the web, and you can just give this link right here to your friends. So maybe you're going to create your own video game website where all of your Unity games are hosted and people can come and play them. So I'll leave this link up here so you can take a look at this finished game, which would be martinknapp.com/unity/unitygame.html. But I really do hope that you take a moment to create your own hosting accounts and learn how to actually upload these games to the web. Otherwise, you can just, of course, go ahead and upload it to a specific standalone executable for either Mac, PC, or Linux. So I hope you've enjoyed this series of creating a very basic, simple level here inside Unity, and really it was designed to give you a good understanding of the basics, but also to kind of open up your mind to all the different possibilities inside Unity and to take a little bit of the scariness away when working with a new program like this. There's a bit of a learning curve, but when you jump right in and you start creating fun levels like this, I hope it kind of takes down that learning curve quite a bit, and I hope you create many exciting worlds that we all will be playing soon.